Hello everyone and welcome to this ILR webinar. We're just waiting for a few more people to join us and then we'll get started. So if you just bear with us for a couple of minutes, please. Hi everyone, we're still waiting for some people to join. Don't want to start too early, so we'll just give them a couple more minutes and then we'll get going. Okay, hello everyone and welcome to today's ILR training webinar. We're still waiting for a few more people to trickle in, but we'll get started so we're not leaving you all waiting. So first of all, I'd just like to introduce myself. My name's Ella Dobbs and I'm a senior analyst in the data assurance team at the OFS. I'm joined on the webinar by my colleague Caroline Charlton, who you would have seen last week if you attended. She ran that session, and she's going to be helping out with the Q&A session as we go through the webinar today. So before we begin, there's a few housekeeping notices. If you have any questions, we encourage you to submit those to us throughout the presentation as they occur to you, but please can you submit them via the Q&A feature, not the chat. The chat should be reserved if you need to talk to one of the panelists. If you're having any technical problems or something, please just drop us a message in there. We'll pause at a couple of points during the webinar to go through the questions that have been submitted so that you'll have those verbally as answers. But we will also potentially take some away depending on how many there are, and all the questions and answers will be typed up and be available after the session on our website. This session is also being recorded, and the slides and the recording will be available alongside the Q&As on our website after today, after a few days. Something else is that live captions are available for this session if you want them, and please click on the closed caption icon. And that's about it really on housekeeping, so we'll get cracking. So today we're going to be talking about the student and their entry qualifications. So the fields around the student themselves and things like their personal characteristics and what they're entering your institution with. So we're going to cover off the definitions of the key fields that we use and how we use them, what they feed into at the OFS. What we expect from you guys in determining these fields and how you should complete them in the ILR. We'll be talking about the evidence that should be kept around these fields. And then we'll go into looking at some common issues that we find when we're out doing audits or other data assurance activities. And we'll go through some examples of things and how you can help yourselves by improving your data quality. And like I've said, we're going to pause for some questions, but please submit those as we go through the Q&A. So this is the list of fields we're going to cover. So as you'll see, there's things related specifically to the student, such as their names and their dates of birth. We've got student characteristics there, and then also some other ID information, and also the fields related to their qualifications on entry. So we always think it's useful for you guys to understand what we use these data for at the OFS. So this is just a bit of information here for you. So personal data such as the names and dates of birth, they are really, really key to allow us to link the ILR data to other sources. So whether that be this data that we get from the student loans company, so we can look at how much student support students are drawing down, or whether that be to the National Pupil Database, so we can look at how students are progressing through their educational experience. We then use some personal characteristic information such as sex and ethnicity, etc., for benchmarking, which is primarily used in the TEF and the performance indicators. So they're really key to make sure that we're therefore benchmarking your performance metrics correctly. We also use some of these personal characteristic fields in allocating our funding. So again, it's key to make sure that we give you the appropriate amount of funding, which obviously everyone cares about. The qualifications on entry information is also used in those benchmarking factors, along with the personal characteristics. So again, really key for the TEF and also for funding. So we use that for funding too. So again, really key that these fields are captured and recorded appropriately. Okay, so let's start by looking at the student and the fields related to them. So hopefully this is one that you're all very familiar with, the LearnRefNumber. So this is the reference number that is associated with a student, and it's assigned by you. It doesn't need to be any particular format. You will give this to a student when they start learning with you, and the student should hold on to that reference number throughout their journey. So if they change courses or progress onto a different course, they should always have that unique LearnRefNumber. Now, it's really important that you don't put personal information in this LearnRefNumber, because we use this field as the unique key to identify a student, and we don't want to see any personal details about that student in that number. Otherwise it gives away information that we shouldn't be seeing. So normally people will use a random string of digits or characters, but yeah, it's really key that you don't put parts of their name or something in that field. Okay, so once the students got their unique key, they obviously have some names. So we have FamilyName and GivenNames, which are basically their surname and then their first names or forenames. Now these names need to be consistent with the student's official ID. Now that includes middle names. So if the student has one middle name, 5 middle names, they all need to be returned in that GivenNames field. We don't want shortened names or nicknames, anything like that. It needs to be their official name. And the reason being is that this is the key field that we use for linking. So if they've given their full name with a middle name to the student loan company, and you've only given us their first name, not their middle name in the ILR, we won't be able to make that link between the two sources and then we get into a bit of trouble. So it's really important that their full name, as listed on their ID, is returned in the ILR. The other thing is we don't want maiden names either. Make sure it is their surname at the time of you completing the ILR. Now, obviously, to make sure you're returning their full name as per their ID, you're going to have to check it against their ID. Now, ideally, you want an ID that has a picture, so a passport or a driving license, because otherwise you can't guarantee that the ID you're checking is for the person that's giving it to you. Now, taking copies of the ID is an ideal way to keep the audit trail. However, I know that there are concerns in this area related to GDPR, etc. So we would expect there to be a trail of evidence to show that the ID has been checked. So, for example, on an enrolment form, there might be a box that says ID being checked, and then the person doing that enrolment signs it or ticks the box or something to say that it has been checked, and then that can be given to an auditor or something as part of your audit trail to the data. Date of birth, so this goes alongside the names, and again it should be checked against the official ID of the student, and please make sure it's in the right format. We've had it sometimes where the date and the month are swapped over accidentally or systematically, so yeah, please make sure that the date of birth is provided in the right order. So common issues that we find with these fields, as I've said, they need to match the ID, and in many cases they don't, because, for example, the student has written their name on the enrolment form and they've used their preferred name, a shortened name, and then actually they are called Edward, not Ed, for example, and the Edward should have been returned as that's what's on their ID. Middle names being excluded is a really common issue, so make sure that they're in. And the other thing is that lots of people don't have the evidence that the IDs have been checked. I've been to providers myself where I've seen an excellent enrolment form, and it's got all the categories there, and it says ID seen, and you're supposed to write in what type of ID and then signed by the person, but it's just not been filled in. So make sure that your processes are being followed even if you have them in place. And to do that, you need really clear guidance to staff about how they should go about doing that and how they should be recording that evidence. I know that a number of providers will get in temps for the really busy enrolment periods and stuff, and when that is the case and it's not people that are used to doing this kind of work, it's really key that they have good instructions on what to follow and what to do. So also just doing spot checks and checks to make sure that these things are being done by your staff is always really helpful to make sure that all the processes are being followed as expected. Okay, domicile. So domicile is the field that holds the country that the student lived in prior to starting their course with you. So it's not necessarily their correspondence address, and it shouldn't be updated as the student progresses through the course. So for example, if I was from Scotland, I lived in Scotland, but I decided to come down and study in Bournemouth, my domicile would be Scotland. Now obviously I would be living in Bournemouth while I was doing my studies, and in my second or third year I'd still be in Bournemouth, but my domicile would always be Scotland because that's where I lived prior to entry to the course. Now there are specific individual separate country codes for the parts of the UK, so make sure that they are captured appropriately and not just a blanket UK code. And one other little thing to point out here is that the GB code is only for nationality. It's not for domicile. So make sure you're using the X codes when you're completing the domicile field. It won't allow you to do the GB one. So common issues on domicile is that insufficient evidence or information is gathered from the student to allow you to determine their domicile. Now, this normally comes down to the fact that enrolment or registration forms aren't clear to the student of what they should be completing in this sort of area. So, for example, if a student has moved before starting their course, they might put where they just moved to, but really they've only moved for the purposes of education, and therefore their domicile should be where they've come from. And so it's key that full information is given to the student to allow them to complete this information appropriately. Domicile should be sort of checked as best it can be. So for students that have a driving license, for example, it's really good evidence because that'll have their home address on it. Now, we appreciate that it's not always possible to check the domicile thoroughly, but you should be assuring yourselves that you got the best information that you can get. So for example, if a student is 18, they've come to you with a French qualification that they've just completed, and they put down their domicile as England, you might want to question that, because it might look as if they are actually from France and they've just moved to England to study with you. So it's always good to check those kinds of students. So checking on things that look odd and target students that have a higher risk of error in the domicile. So for example, students with international qualifications, for example, is always good practice to reduce the risk of having errors in your data. Sex and ethnicity. So sex, this is the legal sex of the learner. And the ethnicity is the ethnic origin of the learner. Now, you can rely on the student's declaration of these fields, but you should be asking your students for this information at least once a year. So every year you should be getting the students to reconfirm this information to you. Now, the easiest way is to do this on some form of re-enrollment form, enrollment forms. And we would strongly encourage you on these forms to have the specific categories of ethnicity listed on the form, so that the student can then just tick which one applies to them. I've seen it before where there's just an empty box and students can write whatever they want. And then that means that you're having to infer, in some cases, what the student's ethnicity is, which is not ideal. We do not want that to be happening. Giving them a list is the best way of making sure that errors don't creep in. So health and disability. So here are 4 fields that basically capture information about whether a student has a disability and the nature of that disability. And we also, through the first one there, the LearnFam type of DLA, allows us to see whether a student's in receipt of disabled students' allowances. So these fields are really important to capture correctly so that we can categorize these students appropriately in any of the analysis that we carry out. So in terms of common issues and good practice, so like I've said before, there are normally errors in coding, normally from providers having to infer things from what the student has told them. So the best thing to do is to give those categories within the ILR to the student, and then you don't have to do any inferring. And then making sure that we recheck that data with the student on re-enrollment each year to make sure that we've got the most up-to-date information for them. Okay, UCAS App ID, UCAS Per ID, and SSN. So UCAS app ID is the UCAS application number, and then the PER ID is the personal identifier. And then the SSN is the student support number. So these fields are basically other IDs for the student. Now, they're currently not mandatory on the ILR. However, we really strongly encourage you to return them. And the reason being is that, again, it makes our linking a lot easier to do. If we've got the SSN, we can link that straight to the SLC data, and then we don't need to worry about the fuzzy linking we have to do on the names and the dates of birth. And the same with the UCAS ones, we can link straight to that UCAS data to gain some enriched data on that student. Another key thing is that if you return the SSN for a student, if their fee is coming straight from the student loan company, then you don't need to return gross fee and net fee. So that will help you out. You don't need to return the fee amounts that are being charged to the student if you return that SSN, because we can obviously get it straight from the student loan company. So the common issues with these is that normally they're not stored in student record systems, and that's why you're finding it hard to return them. They'll be stored in other systems, so maybe the financial systems or something, and so they're not easily available to then export into your XML to submit as part of the ILR. So if you can overcome those issues, that will really help. And then we always find errors in values returned, just typos and things like that. So it's always good to just do a double check of things, cross-check against different sources where you can. And the best practice is to return them where available, because we will use them and it will make our lives a lot easier, and we'll be able to enrich the data that we hold for you as a provider to be used in performance metrics and things like that. Okay, so now moving on to SEC and what I call SOC, but the code is actually SOC 2000. So these are the occupation and socioeconomic classifications. Now, these, if a student is 21 or above in age, then they're of that student. If they're under 21, then it's for their parent or guardian. And again, these fields aren't mandatory, but we're starting to use them more and more in our analysis to enrich the data again. So we strongly encourage you to return them. If your students apply to you through UCAS, then this information is available in the STAR-J data. So you don't need to necessarily collect it from the students. But if you do need to collect it from the students, then you can rely on what the student tells you. You don't need to check up on them about anything like that. And if you are collecting it from the students, again, it's best to give them a particular list for them to choose from, rather than giving them an empty box to type whatever they fancy in, and then you having to infer what that means or trying to map that to one of the relevant codes. So common issues on these areas is, insufficient information gathered from students. So that's where you give that empty box and then you're trying to guess which category that falls into. No one wants to do that kind of guessing. Errors in coding, so typos, just switching around a few numbers. It's easy to do. We all make mistakes. But again, if you can do some spot checks, that's going to help eliminate some of those risks. And good practice is be clear to the student what you're trying to collect. So that's where giving them a list of the appropriate codes is going to work in your favor, hopefully, and give you a much easier job afterwards when you're trying to put it all into your systems. Okay, so they're the main fields in relation to the student and their personal characteristics. So just to talk a little bit about data quality in relation to those, and how you as an organisation can improve the quality of the data yourselves. So spot checks, we probably bang on about these way too much, but you know, do a little audit yourselves. Like all we do is we pick a random sample of students and we'll, you know, check it against the data that's been given by the student. And so you can do that yourselves. Double check the personal data held with the student after it's been input. So give it back to the student and get them to confirm that it is what they said it was. Check things are credible. If you've accidentally typed in a date of birth incorrectly and, you know, it's clearly not feasible, you know, it's after they've started their course, for example, spot things like that to make sure that there's just, you know, not any bonkers data in there, shall we say. Make sure the fields are populated, that they've actually got values in them, they're not blanks, or and check things that you can check against other data sources. So for example, domicile, if for students that have overseas qualifications, as I mentioned before, check that the domicile returned looks appropriate for those students. We do provide some checks to help you through the data checking tool. So we strongly encourage you to use the data checking tool. Submit to it as early as you can on our portal, and that will allow you to get the most out of it. But within the data checking tool this year, we've actually got a new output that's focusing on general quality of the data. And within that, we're going to be highlighting to you where we have where you and your data have high number of unknowns in these categories here. So age, ethnicity, disability, etc. So that hopefully you'll be able to go back and have a look as to why they're unknowns and put your data right if possible. Or if not possible for this year, look at how you can improve your systems and processes for future years. We'll also provide some student demographic splits to allow you to compare your data this year to your data last year. So for example, it might say, last year you had 600 18-year-olds. This year you've only got 10. Are you sure that's right? Kind of thing. So we'll be looking at where things look a little unusual. Okay, I'm just going to pause there for any questions on the student and personal characteristics before we move on to entry qualifications. Caroline, have we had any questions in?
Hi, yes, there's just one that I'd like to talk about. It's not a question so much, just a comment that students often decline to give providers their middle name. I mean, as Ella's already talked about, we are expecting you to check names against identification. So it's really important that the staff who are involved in that know that one of the things that they ought to be looking out for is names that are on official identification, but that haven't been provided by the student. And then your processes need to have a way for that to be dealt with. I mean, that can be as simple as them writing missing names on the enrolment form or entering them into the student record system. But the people responsible for this need to know, one, what they're looking for, and then two, what to do with it. So that's it for the time being. I'll hand back to Ella now.
Great, thanks very much. Yep, and don't worry, if you have any more questions on the student or personal characteristics, then please do keep sending them in and we'll come to them at the end if necessary. Okay, so we'll move now on to qualifications on entry and the fields that we use in relation to this. Okay, so Qualent 3, highest qualification on entry to the instance. Don't ask me why there's a 3. It's a long-standing thing, and to be honest, I don't even know. Apparently, there used to be a Qualent 2 and stuff, but that was before my time. But basically, this is the highest qualification the student holds before starting their course with you. Now, this is not necessarily the qualification they need to get onto the course. There's always the highest. So, for example, if I want to do a foundation degree with you, and all I need to start that foundation degree is 3 A levels, but I actually hold a degree already. Even though I only need A levels to get on to the course, my highest qualification on entry is the degree, and it is the degree that should be returned in the data. Now, as it's for on entry to the course, it shouldn't be updated for any qualifications that are obtained during the course or while the student is studying with you during the instance. So if a student was to gain another qualification from somewhere else halfway through, you shouldn't be updating it to capture that, because we're talking about on entry. Now, there are various different codes that can be used to code up the Qualent 3 within the ILR. And there you will see that there are some mix codes, which basically are the student holds a mix of qualifications that are subject to UCAS tariff, or subject to not subject to UCAS tariff and things. So they should be used when the students have more than one different type of that qualification. So if you have 3 A levels, you've got 3 of them, but they're all A levels. So you should use the code for A levels, P50. But if you've got 2 A levels and a BTEC level 3 diploma, because you've got A levels and a BTEC, they're 2 different types, and therefore I think P93 or something, one of the P90 codes should be used, which is the multiple qualifications subject to UCAS tariff. So yeah, it's important that where they've got different types that you are identifying that by using the mixed codes. Now, a number of students might come to you with international qualifications, so qualifications that they've obtained from overseas institutions. Now, if you have students with these qualifications, you need to be able to determine the level, equivalent level in the UK for these qualifications. So whether they're equivalent to level 3, so A levels, or they might be equivalent to a degree or something, so at a higher level. And you should use UK NARIC to do that. So UK NARIC provide a service where you can give them the qualification that the student has shown you, and they will then tell you what the equivalent of that is. Now, when you get that equivalence back, you shouldn't put the code for the equivalent. So for example, if they say this is equivalent to A levels, you don't put the A levels code, because it's not an A level. If it was equivalent to A levels, therefore equivalent to level 3, you would use the other qualification at level 3 code, so P80. And then the equivalent things in the other levels as well. So that's a really important thing to note. So you should be asking the student for details of all of the qualifications they hold, so that you've got sufficient information to allow you to code the Qualent 3 appropriately. Now, UCAS will obviously give you information on this if you have students joining you through UCAS. And the personal learning record, so the PLR data, should also be used to help you verify qualifications or filling in where you might have missing gaps for students and things. So try and get data from as many different sources as you can. So I thought it would be useful just to go through a few examples of how Qualent 3 should be coded, just so we're hopefully all clear. So a student enters with 2 level 3 BTEC diplomas. Now, they have 2 of them, but they are the same qualification. So P41, which is level 3 diploma, should be used within the Qualent 3 field to reflect that. A student enters a HND, so starting a HND with you, and they've got A levels and a level 3 BTEC diploma. Now, because they've got the A levels and the BTEC, 2 different types of level 3 qualification, they should be P93. So that was that mix one that I was talking about in relation to mixed level 3 qualifications, which are all subject to UCAS tariff. Okay, So we've got a student that comes to study a degree in chemistry with you, and A-levels or equivalent qualifications in maths and chemistry are required for entry. So they've got to have that maths A-level and that chemistry A-level to study it. The student has these, so they've got those A-levels, but they also have a foundation degree in music. Now, obviously, the foundation degree in music is pretty irrelevant to do that degree in chemistry, I would say. But obviously, a foundation degree is higher than the A-levels. And so the Qualent 3 should be J10 for foundation degree to reflect that that's the highest qualification on entry that they enter the course with. Okay, a student with a Romanian baccalaureate as their highest qualification comes to you, and as it's an international qualification, UK NARIC are consulted to identify the equivalent level, and they have said that it is equivalent to level 3. So therefore, the Qualent 3 should be P80, which is other qualification at level 3, to be returned in the ILR. Okay, so there's some quite straightforward examples, hopefully. So I now want to talk about the difference between an instance versus an aim when it comes to qualifications on entry. So a coherent engagement with the provider by a student aiming towards the award of one or more qualifications or a credit is an instance. So it might mean that they study for one qualification aim and then another qualification aim straight afterwards. Now, if they are at the same broad level, for example, undergraduate, that's the broad level we're talking about, then this should be treated as the same instance. So, for example, a student comes and does a HNC with you, and then they all, after they've completed the HNC, they move straight on to do the HND, so topping up to the HND. Now, because the HNC and the HND are at the same broad level, they're both undergraduate, then that should all be treated as the same instance. So the qualifications on entry for the HNC will be the same as the qualifications for on entry for the HND. So you don't update the qualifications on entry once the student has gained the HNC to move on to the HND, because it's the same instance. Now, students also, I imagine, quite a lot of the time will decide to transfer between courses. They don't like chemistry and they want to move on to physics, for example. That again is the same instance. And so even though they might have got some credits from their chemistry degree, you don't update their qualification on entry because it's not a new instance. The qualification on entry for the chemistry degree is the same for the physics degree. Now, sometimes students might follow two completely distinct instances at the same time. So they're doing a HNC in maths and they also want to do a HNC in business. They're, both part-time, doing them side by side. Where that's the case, then you would look at what their entry qualifications are for each instance separately. So let's look at some more detailed examples on Qualent 3. So a student enters a provider with A-levels, completes a HNC in engineering, and then progresses immediately to a HND top-up in engineering at the same provider. Now, the HND, as I said a minute ago, should be considered as part of the same instance as the HNC. Therefore, the Qualent 3 for the HND aim is still P50, those A-levels, as it's the same as when they entered the HNC with those A-levels. Another example is the same student enrolls on a part-time HNC in Spanish in their second year of study alongside the HND in engineering. Now, this is where the two qualifications are completely distinct. They're just doing two at the same time. And you can't count the Spanish credits towards the engineering qualifications. So you would treat them as two separate instances. So the qualent 3 for the HNC in Spanish would be the HNC in engineering. So because last year they did the HNC in engineering, and then the current year they're doing the HND in engineering and the HNC in Spanish, when they entered the Spanish HNC, the highest qualification they held was the HNC in engineering. So that's what must be returned. Okay, so a student studies and achieves a HNC, having entered with both A levels and A level 3 BTEC diploma. The student leaves the college with no intention of returning. So they finished, they've gone, said goodbye. A year later, they decide to come back and enroll on a HND top-up. Now, because they've had that break in learning, they've left, you've said goodbye, and this is a completely new application to come back again. The qualification on entry would be the HNC that they left with previously. So again, you need to make sure that you're looking at the right qualification on entry for the instance that they are about to start. Okay, so the common issues we find in relation to qualifications on entry is inaccurate coding. Now, there's big ones about those P93s, P94s, so those mixed codes not being used appropriately. We'll see that, you know, a student has A levels and a BTEC, but you've just picked A levels, just picked one over the other. That's incorrect. You should be using that mixed code. We also have it where, you know, someone has a diploma, but it's been put down as a certificate, you know, things like that. The PAT, so the level 3 other qualifications, should only really be used for international students, but that gets used a lot for just students that have any other sort of qualification that they're not quite sure where to code. So it's really important that the staff who are coding up the qualent 3 for students have clear guidance on how that should be done. We see it where insufficient information is being gathered from either the student or other sources to determine it, like you've only collected what's required for the course, not all of the qualifications that the student holds. Evidence isn't kept, so when we come in to audit, we can't see that you saw their certificates or taken a copy of their certificates, for example. So again, like with the ID, if you don't want to take a copy of the certificates and hold that on file, then you'll need to have some other process to show the audit trail that you have seen those certificates. So whether that be a tick box or a signature just by the member of staff to say that they've seen the certificates from the student to allow you to identify the qualent 3, then that's absolutely fine. Please don't rely on students to identify the level of their qualification. They'll more than likely get it wrong. So it's best if you do that, having all the knowledge that you would hold. Okay, so good practice is, as I've said, make sure you ask for all details of all qualifications that a student holds, not just what's required for the course. Keep evidence of the that you've seen the certificates during the enrollment process or something. And also, it's always helpful to keep evidence for a short time in terms of a hard evidence, like a copy of the certificate, to allow someone to double check what someone's done. Because obviously if you have just done the sign a box and that this has been seen, no one can double check that that's been coded appropriately by a member of staff. So if you are able to take a copy of the certificate for somebody else to double check the appropriate coding, that's really helpful. Make sure you use the UCAS and the PLR and other sources of information that you can gain to get that information. Like I've said, make sure your staff have sufficient training on how the codes should be used. and use some validation and checks to make sure that you spot odd things, outliers. Make sure that an international student is likely to have a PAT, for example, that other qualification at level 3. If you've got a UK domiciled student, that's from down the road, why have they been coded as PAT, for example? Things like that will always help spot errors. Okay, so the other field we use alongside Qualent 3 in relation to entry quals is the ELQ field. So this is capturing whether a student is aiming for an equivalent or lower qualification than one they already have. So if I have a degree and I'm aiming for another degree, that is equivalent to what I already hold. So therefore I am an ELQ because I'm aiming for an equivalent or lower qualification. If you're just progressing up, so I had a foundation degree and I'm now going for a top up to my degree, I'm not an ELQ because I'm stepping up the ladder, shall we say. But there are some exceptions to the ELQ guidance, and that's when you become an exempt ELQ. So, for example, foundation degrees. If you've got a degree and you're aiming for a foundation degree, now technically that is lower than the qualification I already hold. But because it's a foundation degree, it's a special category that is exempt from the ELQ policy. And so you would need to put me as an exempt ELQ in your data. Now, the list of categories is a bit complicated, and I'm not going to go through them all now because I'll probably get them wrong without having the guidance in front of me. But when you're coding these up, make sure you have the guidance there to tell you what's an exempt and what's a non-exempt ELQ. And that guidance is available in the HESIS guidance. So here's a couple of examples on ELQ. So a student enters to your provider with a level 3 BTEC diploma and is aiming for a HND in business. The qualification they are aiming for the HND is clearly higher than the one that they already hold. So level 3 going up to level 5 HND. So the HND is higher and therefore they should be coded as ELQ equals 3. Not ELQ. A student enters a provider with a BA in English Lit and is aiming for a foundation degree in social care. The qualification they are aiming for is lower than the one, so degree level 6, foundation degree level 5, so it is lower. However, as I said before, a foundation degree is one of those exempt categories from the ELQ policy, and therefore the student should be coded as ELQ equals 2, which is exempt ELQ. So the common issues that we find is the inaccurate coding, mainly around those exemptions. So make sure that you've read up on those before you start coding this. Where you've got insufficient evidence or information on entry qualifications, then it makes it really hard to do your ELQ because you don't know what the student's coming in with. And then also the incorrect coding comes when there's inconsistency between the aim of the course and the qualifications on entry in the Qualent 3 field. So cross-checking between those is really important, and that's one of the points we've made in those good practice points. So risk-based checking is a good way to approach things. So, for example, young students are coming straight from doing their A-levels, for example. So age 18, for example, they're going to be at a much lower risk of aiming for an ELQ because they obviously haven't had as much time to do lots of qualifications. Whereas a mature student could have gone off and done multiple different qualifications, and therefore they're at higher risk of aiming for an ELQ, and therefore should be checked more rigorously when doing this. And you should review the ELQ status for a student every year because it should be updated as it impacts on your funding. So in terms of data quality, we've been through a few of these already. We'll just go through them again. So these are some checks that you could be carrying out internally to make sure that your data is as robust as possible. So double check that the coding of qualifications is appropriate. So, you know, spot check some students, do that mini audit again, select some students and check them against that source evidence. Check that the PATs are only mainly used for international students or students coming in with international qualifications. If you've got home students with that PAT, you need to be really sure that it's genuine, that they should be coded as PAT. Check for students with like extremely high entry qualifications compared for their course. Might look a little odd, so it might look like something's gone wrong there, so have a little look. And also for their age, you know, really high, you know, an 18-year-old with a PhD, something might be a bit strange there. I mean, they might be extremely intelligent, but it might be worth having a little double check of that. Review records with unusual qualent 3 values for the provider. So if it's unlikely that any of your students are to come in with a PhD, for example, check that. Check your ELQs have been used appropriately, especially the ELQ equals 9, which is the not required code. And double check your ELQs for those mature students because they're more likely to have an ELQ. So again, in the data checking tool, we're going to have some checks to help you go and to hopefully validate your data a bit more. So we're going to have some highlighted areas where you've got a high number of unknown qualent 3. So if you haven't filled in the qualifications on entry, or you've used the X06 code, I want to say, which is the unknown code, we'll be flagging those to you to say, are you sure these are unknown? Please go and double check. And we'll also be showing you proportions of students by entry qualifications across years. So for example, it will show you last year you had 100 students entering with A-levels. This year you've got 500 students entering with A-levels. Can you explain this? So just to allow you to assure yourselves of the data. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say in terms of the presentation. So I'm going to pass over to Caroline to see what questions we have.
Hello. So again, there's just one question that I'd like to talk about, which was a question from somebody about whether for mature students it was okay to accept the student declaration of qualent 3. Now, as Ella has already said, there are some real dangers about asking students what their qualent 3 is. They may well not understand what qualifications they have, or certainly what level of qualifications you have. So if you're asking them to sort of tick a box, there's a danger that they'll just give you inaccurate information. Even relying on students to provide you with a list of their qualifications, it may well be that they don't provide you with enough information to code qualent 3 accurately. We see quite a lot of examples of this through audit, where enrolment forms try and capture this information, and students might just put the subject of the course or give you an awarding body without the level, but certainly often don't provide enough information to actually code qualent 3 accurately. I mean, the other reason why you really can't rely on the student declaration is that you also do need to be able to evidence that the value that you have returned is accurate. So that means that if you haven't got copies of certificates, you need to be able to evidence that they have been checked. And again, you know, if staff are checking certificates against information from students, they also need a way to correct that information if it's not accurate. So in short, no, you can't unfortunately rely on the student declaration, and there's lots of good reasons for that. You do need to do some work with it, and we do appreciate that that can be really tricky for mature students where you can't rely on UCAS information or the PLR, but in those cases you do need to ask to see certificates from those students.
Can I just add something to that a minute, Caroline? Sorry.
Yes, of course.
I was just going to say that we know that in exceptional circumstances that, I mean, I've had it before where providers have had a refugee, for example, and they fled their country and they don't have anything to prove what qualifications they have. Now, basically, we would expect you as a provider to take the necessary steps to assure yourselves in those situations that the student has the qualification that they say they have. So that might be through questioning them about the topic that they say they have, or, you know, trying to find out as much information from them as possible on that qualification on entry. Now, that will be a bit time consuming, but we hope that it doesn't happen it's a very rare circumstance. But if you do have anyone in that sort of situation where there is just no evidence whatsoever, do the best you can to assure yourselves of what they can, and just keep that as an audit trail for if we were to come and audit you, for example.
Great, thanks, Ella. And so that was the only question I wanted to talk about. I can see that a couple have come in now, but I haven't had a chance to read them. We will put all of the questions and answers in the question and answer document that we'll be publishing on the website in due course. So we'll deal with any of those questions that we haven't looked at through that document. And just a reminder that we will be sending a request for feedback to participants who've agreed to receive that. We would really value your feedback, so please do respond to that if you can. And then the only other thing to do is to thank you for joining us today, and we hope that as many of you as possible will be able to join us next week and in the rest of the webinars. Thanks ever so much.
Thanks, everyone.